Welcome to a three-part lecture on the populist movement. Today's lecture will be on the origins of the populist movement and the creation of the People's Party. Lecture 2 on the populist movement will deal specifically with the policies that the People's Party endorsed, and we have a primary document that shows the varying policies that were endorsed by this movement, known as the Omaha Platform. And then Lecture 3 will deal with the elections and the legacy of the populist movement. Now, if you go to slide 2 here, you'll see that I have cut and pasted into our PowerPoint presentation the second potential essay question. And so you'll want to keep this question in mind as we go through these next 3 lectures. Who were the populists and what did they attempt to accomplish? To what degree were they successful? And so this is a question that is in 2 parts. You'll need to indicate a full-fledged understanding of the varying elements that made up this movement, and also assess whether they were successful or not. And this will require a fair amount of analysis and critical thinking as you pull it all together. So we'll have this lecture, Populist Part 2 lecture, Populist Part 3 lecture, the Omaha Platform primary document, and the textbook, of course, and this will provide you with ample information to do a bang-up job in putting together a draft essay for this particular question. Now, if you go to slide 3, you'll see that it says trouble on the farm, and we know through the readings that there has been a lot of trouble throughout all of the United States. There is a fair amount of attention given to the labor strife throughout industrial America, and throughout the extractive industries in the West. We have industrialization in full swing, and what comes with this is a wage work compensation and a laissez-faire dynamic, which oftentimes leads employees into despair. There are no regulations, there's no minimum wage, there's no workman's comp, there's no safety regulations, there's no child labor laws. There is really nothing that can protect the employee short of unionization and collective action. And the textbook does a pretty good job showing how unionization was an uphill battle, in large part because of racial and ethnic divisions amongst employees themselves, but also because big business did have access to the machinery of power. Sometimes the National Guard or even the Army would be called out to break up strikes. And the Pinkertons could be employed by businesses as private armies to crush the labor movement as well. And so although there were certainly intense problems throughout industrial America, throughout urban America, there are also going to be some pretty significant struggles for small to mid-sized farmers throughout rural America. And interestingly enough, this populist movement is going to originate out in the countryside. The farmers are going to be the ones that politicize, that attempt to bring working class people from all sections of the economy together in an effort to wrestle control of the federal government away from big business, away from corporations, who seemingly had been able to purchase politicians to pass policies that would benefit them at the expense of everybody else. And I find this to be particularly fascinating, the fact that the populist movement really begins in the countryside, because when I think of farmers, I tend to think of these type of people that are hyper-individualistic, who attempt to solve problems on their own. But here in the late 19th century, these farmers are going to come to the realization that working independently will lead to nowhere. It will take cooperation and collective action amongst farmers and other elements of a aggrieved society in order to affect real change. And so the goal here for the populist movement, led by these farmers, is to wrestle control of the federal government away from big business. Now, how come farmers came to this conclusion? What was the trouble on the farm that led them to politicize in such a manner? The farmers are going to identify many different villains as to why their standard of living is eroding, why they are losing their farms, falling into debt, what is happening around them. If we go to slide number 4, we can see that farmers are really trying to hold on to some semblance of financial security. There is a process that is underway by the time we make our way into the second half of the 19th century. And the famed late historian Howard Zinn captures this process in his A People's History of the United States, one of the greatest synthesis of all time, a very popular book about American history through the eyes of ordinary Americans rather than simply through the perspective of those who have power, like presidents and titans of industry. But you see this one quote taken from A People's History of the United States. By 1880, 25% of all farms were rented by tenants, and the number kept rising. Many did not even have money to rent and became farm laborers. By 1900, there were 4.5 million farm laborers in the country. It was the fate that awaited every farmer who couldn't pay his debts. So what Howard Zinn is identifying here is that farmers are falling further and further into debt. They're unable to hold on to their farms. They are losing their farms and becoming tenant farmers, or renting their farms, or becoming sharecroppers, or becoming farm laborers. They're losing their livelihood, becoming dependent upon landlords, or becoming dependent upon agribusiness as farm laborers. That individualism that very much is associated with ownership of one's own private property is very much eroding, and farmers are wondering what's happening. They can look across the fence and say, oh, Farmer Jones just lost his farm. Look across the other fence, Farmer Johnson just lost his farm, and look at their own account books and say, wow, we're falling further and further into debt as well. We had to take out a second mortgage on our farm, and we can't even afford to pay the first mortgage. And it looks like foreclosure might be our fate. And enough farmers start to wake up to this reality and begin talking to one another. And this is ultimately what is going to lead to the formation of the populist movement, which becomes intensely politicized under the institution, under the political party, the People's Party. Now, why was this happening? What was happening to the farmer? What were the villains that were identified by these farmers? And one of the primary villains, as we'll see on slide number 5, is the railroad. Small and mid-sized farmers felt as if they were really being exploited by this most lucrative and powerful of big businesses. The railroad, as I indicated in a previous lecture, was America's first big business. And the independent railroad corporations had monopolies over independent rail lines. And with monopolies, these railroads could charge whatever they wanted for passenger or freight rates. And so the farmer felt as if the railroad was gouging them, paying too much for these freight rates, giving kickbacks to large farms, agribusinesses, allowing them, because they shipped in bulk, to pay less for their freight rates. And so the small to mid-sized farmer could not compete with the big farms because they paid more for their freight rates, and because they didn't sell at the level of volume that the big farmers did. And so the railroads, they became identified as really public enemy number one for the farmers. And there's a call for a fairer freight rate, something that the farmer could afford. The profits for the railroads were really going through the roof. And you can kind of think about big oil today to kind of put yourself in the mindset of these farmers. I mean, when we go to the gas pump and we see that it's $4.25 a gallon, we can't believe it. I can't believe it's at $4.25 a gallon. And then we read in the newspaper that the big oil has seen higher profits than they have ever seen in their entire existence. And we kind of scratch our head and say, well, why is this the case? How can the oil corporations be making more money than they ever have before, and they keep jacking up the gasoline prices? And well, because they have a great deal of power over us, and they have a great deal of power over the government. And the government, therefore, doesn't make any moves to regulate the industry in a way that might benefit the rest of society. And you can see the farmer is identifying this relationship here on slide number 5. It's this railroad monster that's out to attack them, but in the background, the railroad has the federal government in its grasp, and is able to really control the federal government in a way that prevents reform or regulation of the railroad industry from taking place. So the railroad is identified as one of the reasons why the farmers' livelihood is being threatened. Too much of the profits that the farmer is willing to is able to generate is going into freight rates, and that's certainly going to hurt the farmer in the pocketbook. If we go to slide number 6, we'll see another issue that garners the attention of the small and mid-sized farmer. We have a protective tariff. This is a certain deviation of laissez-faire principles. The federal government is going to put a tariff in place with the purpose of benefiting American manufacturers. Now, the tariff is something that benefits one element of society and can end up harming another element of society. Certainly, this protective tariff that's in place during the 19th century is going to benefit American manufacturers, those who produce material goods. So if you have a factory that produces steel plows, or a factory that produces pots and pans, or a factory that produces t-shirts in the United States, the protective tariff can be beneficial. Why? Because the tariff is a tax placed on goods imported into the country. And the idea here is to make it easier for American manufacturers to outcompete foreign companies that are trying to sell their products within our national borders. For example, if you have a U.S. t-shirt manufacturer who maybe doesn't run on optimal efficiency, has higher labor costs, had to put a lot of money into starting the company up, might be able to only sell their t-shirt at $1 in order to have any expectation of any reasonable profit. Whereas maybe a t-shirt company in England has cheaper labor costs, has already paid down its startup capital, maybe runs more efficiently, can sell their t-shirt for as low as 50 cents a pop in the United States. And so the American consumer who goes into a store in the United States sees two t-shirts of equivalent quality, and one is $1 and one is 50 cents. Well, unless they're hyper-patriotic and have an unlimited amount of disposable income, will purchase the shirt made in England rather than the shirt made in the United States. This is where the tariff comes into play. The tariff is a tax placed on those goods imported into the United States. So that English shirt now will be taxed, and sometimes the taxes were in excess of the price of the commodity itself. So you might see a 75% tax attached to those goods imported from England. So the English t-shirt now costs $1.25, whereas the American t-shirt, American produced t-shirt, does not have the tariff applied to it, so it's still selling for $1. So when the consumer goes into the American store, they see two t-shirts that are of equivalent quality. The American one now is selling for $1, and the English produced t-shirt is going for $1.25. The consumer is now going to purchase the American t-shirt. So American manufacturers very much are dependent upon this tariff to exist, and it allows them to dominate the American market. Now, if you own the factory that produces the t-shirt or the steel plow or the pots and the pans in the United States, you love the tariff, you clamor for the tariff, you try to get elected politicians who support the tariff, and perhaps if you are an employee who works in one of these factories in the United States, you like the tariff because you might recognize that the tariff is necessary for that factory to exist. Without the tariff, you might not have any job whatsoever. So the tariff is really important for those who make their money through manufacturing, either in terms of owning the manufacturing business or working within that company. But for the farmer, this tariff on manufactured products is something that really hurts them. A farmer does not make his money through manufacturing, he makes his money through agricultural enterprise. So when the farmer goes into the store to buy a t-shirt or a steel plow or pots and pans, he quickly realizes that with the tariff in place, he is paying more for his consumer products than he would otherwise. What happened to that 50-cent t-shirt? What happened to that steel plow that used to go for a fraction of the cost that I'm now paying? The farmer is paying more for his consumer products with the tariff in place than he would be without the tariff in place. And if you add up all of those consumer products, it's going to be a significant hit to the farmer's livelihood. So the farmer has identified two primary external explanations for why they are falling further and further into debt. The profits that they generate through the sale of their crops is going to be chipped into by these, what they perceive to be exorbitant freight rates charged by the railroad. And also, their money isn't going as far as it used to because the tariff has inflated the price of their consumer products. And so the farmers are looking for a method to address these two big threats to their family income, to their family livelihood. If you go to slide 7 here, you actually see that for the average farmer, they are in the red as we make our way through the 19th century. Consumer prices are going to be higher than farm income. And so if the farmer is bringing in less than he is spending, that means he is falling further and further into debt. And if the farmer cannot pay his debt off, then he is going to experience foreclosure, be kicked off the farm, and as Howard Zinn indicated, find himself renting his land from a larger landowner, becoming a sharecropper, or becoming a mere farm laborer, very much dependent upon somebody else rather than able to make his own living in a way that his family had for generations, perhaps. And so the farmer is looking around, recognizing that he is not alone. Other farmers are going through the same thing, and perhaps it would behoove them to come together collectively, cooperate in an effort to get out from behind this 8-ball of the protective tariff and the railroads. And keep in mind here that the farmer is starting to put it together. Whoa, what's coming out of the federal government? The federal government is being dominated by the railroad corporations. The federal government is being dominated by big business, these titans of manufacturing, and they're therefore able to get the tariff implemented. But the farmer is not going to start at the federal level. Rather, the farmer is going to start at the local level. And let's take a look at the road to the formation of a institutionalized political party known as the People's Party that is really going to have designs to wrestle control of the federal government away from the railroad corporations and other manufacturing corporations. Let's go ahead and turn to slide 8 here, and you'll see farmers and the road to the People's Party. And the first bullet point reads, cooperatives and the farmers' alliances. Well, the farmers are going to start very much locally. They're going to try to work cooperatively in order to try to save some money here and there. For example, one cooperative decided to actually pool their crops together and ship them on the railroads at the same time. So the wheat farmers would bundle up their wheat and communicate with other farmers and say, hey, on the second Monday of June, we're going to go down to the depot together, and we're going to ship all of our wheat at the same time and get the freight rate that one gets when they ship in bulk. And this ended up saving the small farmer and the mid-sized farmer a fair amount of money in shipping costs. And so a little cooperation, kind of shedding themselves of their hyper-individualism, is going to generate some modicum of success. But this is not going to solve all of the problems. Still, the freight rates are pretty high. The tariff is still cutting into their bottom line. Farmers are still experiencing foreclosure. And so these cooperatives really kind of grow into these larger farmers' alliances, and we end up having the formation of two broad-based farmers' alliances, the Southern Farmers Alliance and the Western Farmers Alliance. It's going to link up communities throughout these entire regions, and they feel as if now that more and more farmers are working cooperatively, then maybe greater change can take place. For example, in the South, the Farmers Alliance actually ushered in a boycott. There was a jute bag manufacturer A jute bag is this kind of big canvas bag with a drawstring, and cotton farmers would put their cotton into the jute bag. And the jute bag manufacturer ended up increasing the price of each jute bag by 5 cents. And so the Southern farmers, through the Southern Farmers Alliance, engineered this boycott. They started to make their own jute bags, started to work collectively to avoid relying heavily on the jute bag manufacturing company. And this ultimately forced the hand of the jute bag manufacturer, who now was selling only a fraction of its product, to revoke that 5-cent increase. And so this cooperative or collective action proved to generate some tangible economic benefits. But this is, I guess, small potatoes, if you will. There are some pretty significant structural problems written into the American economy from the perspective of the small to mid-sized farmer. So as these cooperatives grew into farmers' alliances, these farmers' alliances were going to grow into something more politically vibrant. And the outgrowth of this is the formation of the People's Party. This is the political party of the populist movement here in the latest stages of the 19th century. But what these farmers realized full well was that if they were going to go it alone, they were not going to have any sort of electoral victory. They needed to recruit. They needed people from other elements of society to cast their ballot for the People's Party. And so let's go ahead and turn to slide number 9 here, and we'll see that the People's Party is going to reach out to different elements of the population by endorsing policies that were desirable to them. And we can see here that there are 4 major groups that these farmers are going to be reaching out to. Prohibitionists, which are largely individuals who belong to Christian societies. So we'll talk about prohibitionists and what their goals were, and why the People's Party saw them as a desirable ally. We'll talk about some of the reformers, varying groups out there who identified certain particular issues in society that might be natural vote givers for the People's Party come election day. We'll talk about how these farmers were reaching out to the industrial workers, although the industrial worker made his living in a very different way than the smaller mid-sized farmer. If this alliance could be forged, then there is no election that the People's Party would ever lose, from dog catcher all the way up to the presidency. The vast majority of Americans were either small to mid-sized farmers or industrial workers. What an alliance this would make. This is going to be a difficult sell, as we'll see, but the effort is certainly there to get small and mid-sized farmers and the industrial worker in the same political camp. And then in the South particularly, there is an effort to move beyond distrustful race relations in the South, to transcend racial differences, to come into a political alliance. And so there'll be an attempt in the South to get whites and blacks to work together within this People's Party structure. And this is going to be a difficult sell as well, considering that the Civil War was only a quarter of a century before the People's Party came into existence. And there was still some palpable racial tensions in America. As we know about the 19th century, there are some horrible race relations, to say the least. So let's go ahead and go through the People's Party and the attempt to forge a broad alliance by recruiting these varying elements. Okay, if we turn to slide 10 here, we'll see that it reads prohibitionists. The prohibitionists, of course, were those who were trying to prohibit the manufacturing and selling of alcohol, and even the consumption of alcohol. These prohibitionists had been around for a very long time, dating at least back to the 1820s. But the movement had been growing, and the movement had been growing because there were certain people who identified alcohol abuse as the source of almost every social ill. For example, many prohibitionists believed that unemployment was a result of alcoholism, that somebody might have too much to drink on a Sunday and then call in sick on a Monday. And you do that enough times and you lose your job. There were those who believed over alcohol consumption led to domestic abuse. Man goes down to the pub, has too much to drink, goes home, beats his wife and kids. Many believe that prostitution was linked to alcoholism. You go get drunk, a little randy, go down to the brothel. This could lead to a health issue throughout society. Many of these prohibitionists argued. In short, the prohibitionists believed that there was a need to reform society through legislation that would curb the amount of alcohol one can consume and maybe even do away with devil rum entirely. If you go to slide 11, you'll see the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was led predominantly by women but did have some male membership. Women believed that they had the most benefit if they could get prohibition legislated. And of course, women in the 19th century were dependent upon the income of the men in their lives for the most part. And so if unemployment was a big social and economic problem, women were going to, of course, experience that wrath. Certainly prostitution might bring disease into the homes of these women. Domestic abuse, of course, was something that many women were concerned about as they sought to protect themselves and their children from violence. And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union really was dominated by women as we make our way through the 19th century. Interesting thing about these women who belonged to the WCTU, what they were ultimately doing is appropriating the concept of the cult of domesticity here on slide 12. The cult of domesticity maintained that there were two different spheres, one for men, one for women. Men were out in the public sphere where they participated in the economy, where they participated in politics, whereas women were relegated to the domestic sphere or the home. They were in charge of rearing the children, providing a tranquil environment for their husbands to return to when they got out of the jungle of the public world. And this was argued to be logical, as women were more moral and ethical than their male counterparts. The idea was that the man was out there almost like an animal, trying to buy low, sell high, jockey for positioning within the political arena, while women were more in tune with what was right or wrong, what was more moral or immoral, and this was the cult of domesticity. Women were charged with this responsibility of civilizing their male counterparts at home and their children. But what the WCTU was doing was appropriating this notion of the cult of domesticity. And they began to make the argument that if women are more moral and ethical than their male counterparts, why wouldn't you want them to be out in the public sphere? Why wouldn't you want them to become politicized? Why wouldn't you want policies, legislation that spoke to the better angels of our culture and society? And so the WCTU is making a pretty nice political move here, cloaking themselves in this, wrapping themselves in this idea that women are moral and ethical, and using that as a justification for getting out into society and calling for a significant reform through government. One of the leading members of the WCTU was Carrie A. Nation, here on slide 13, somewhat of the quintessential old battle axe. She has the battle axe in one hand and the Bible in the other. This is very much a religiously driven effort here on the part of the prohibitionists. And that was her real name, Carrie A. Nation. She's going to put the nation on her back and carry it to salvation. And she was very high profile. She was generating a great deal of media attention because she was prone to dramatics. She would travel around the country. She would go into different saloons or bars and plead with the bartender to close down his immoral operation. And when the bartender refused to listen to her pleas, she would pull out the battle axe and begin to bash the bar up. And of course, the media ate all of this up. And this might not be the personification of the cult of domesticity, but nevertheless it was good in creating a national discourse as to whether prohibition was a desirable policy or not. You get the media attention, you get the conversations, and perhaps you can get the edge. Now, the People's Party recognizes that the WCTU and other prohibitionist organizations are already organized, already have members, and already have supporters. And so if the People's Party embraces prohibition as a policy, then they can simply put their straw into the milkshake of the prohibitionist movement. This would be some automatic votes, and there's even some discussion in the People's Party ranks to extend the right to vote to women. And certainly this would, maybe not in the first election that the People's Party runs in, but in the not too distant future, generate so many new votes that the electoral possibilities of this new party would be limitless. As you can see on slide 15, it says the proposed suffrage amendment, the platform and resolutions endorsed by the People's Party. And although the People's Party did not embrace granting women the right to vote in 1892 in the Omaha platform, this was certainly something that they were considering in an effort to grow their alliance as broadly as possible. If we go to slide number 16, we see the industrial worker. The industrial worker is somebody who works in manufacturing or in extractive industries. Their lives are following a very different cadence than the small to mid-sized farmer. The agricultural industry and the manufacturing and extractive industries are very different, to say the least. But these small and mid-sized farmers and these industrial workers are working class Americans, and what these farmers who are attempting to organize this broad alliance for the People's Party recognize is that they have more in common than there are dissimilarities. And perhaps relying upon this notion of the producer ethic might pull the two groups into the same political camp. What the People's Party leadership is doing here is creating a dichotomy. There are the wealthy and powerful in society that have been able to gain control of government, and there are the laborers, the producers in society, who are really being very much aggrieved. And the idea here is that those who make their money off the labor of somebody else or make their money off of a process are the wealthiest people in society and have used that wealth in order to pretty much destroy a democracy as it should be. And so what these People's Party leaders are doing is traveling around to the cities of America, delivering speeches to industrial workers and saying, look, we make something through our own hard work. We produce steel plows or pants or shirts or pots and pans, or we produce food that is necessary for us to live. We make something, and we actually provide a service of use, whereas the bankers and these financiers, they make their money off of other people's money. The railroad is skimming their profits off the top. The manufacturers, they are making their profits off the labor of the industrial worker. What we need to do here, the People's Party leadership argues, is emphasize that there is a division in society between those who work for a living and provide for overall society and those who make their livelihood off of the labor of others. And this is a very powerful idea. There's a reason why there are 1,000,001 lawyer jokes. Lawyers make their money off of a process, while we still have a fair amount of admiration for those who, sport a top hat and go to work actually building something. And so the People's Party is attempting to tap into this overarching view of what is an ethical way of making a living, and how that translates into the power dynamic, who has access to government, who is able to influence the trajectory of history. And this is going to be a difficult sell because, as I mentioned, the industrial worker and the small to mid-sized farmer have very different lives, belong to very different kind of cultural atmospheres. And as we'll see, the policies that impact farmers in a particular way oftentimes impact the industrial worker in an opposite fashion, and vice versa. So when it comes down to policy, will this producer ethic be able to hold? Will the producer ethic serve as a strong enough glue to keep these two camps together under the tent of the People's Party? And it's going to be difficult. You see on slide number 17 the biracial coalition. This is most important in the South, where we have white and black sharecroppers, white and black tenant farmers, and even some white and black small to mid-sized farmers who vote for different political parties. We know that many African Americans don't have the right to vote, but those who do have the right to vote, vote almost exclusively, really exclusively, for the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, while essentially all white Southerners vote for the Democratic Party. And race is really used as a wedge issue throughout the South for political purposes. And the racial issue really prevents any major change to take place throughout the South. And this is recognized by certain individuals throughout the South. There needs to be something done about this. The racial division is getting in the way of collective action that is necessary to bring about reform and alter the way that government actually operates. To bear this out, let's go ahead and turn our attention to slide 18 with Tom Watson. Tom Watson is going to join this People's Party. He is going to be part of this populist movement. And his life really makes him a strange leader for this attempted biracial coalition. What do I mean by that? Well, Tom Watson was born in Georgia. He was born into a very wealthy family that owned hundreds upon hundreds of acres of land. His parents owned slaves, but the Civil War broke out, and there was a great deal of fighting throughout the South, and plantations were burned to the ground, and slaves were able to run away. And coming out of the Civil War, Tom Watson's parents ended up falling upon hardship. They lost their plantation. They purchased a small farm, and Tom Watson went from a childhood in which he had a relatively lavish life to one of struggle, where he remembered not even being able to afford shoes. And he, like almost all white Southerners, was a member of the Democratic Party when he became an adult, but he kept coming back to this issue that he identified. The Democratic Party claims to be the white man's party, but the Democratic Party never does anything for the small to mid-sized farmer. And there's a continual emphasis on racial supremacy and racial domination, but the economic issues that really impact the working class white person throughout the South is never really addressed. And so he saw the People's Party as an opportunity to be able to break through this overemphasis on race and underemphasis on class-based issues. And so Tom Watson would travel around the South giving speeches to all black audiences, to all white audiences, sometimes integrated audiences. And his message was always that the biracial coalition, or this biracial alliance within the People's Party, would not be a social alliance. It would not be a cultural alliance. It was a political and economic alliance. Whites and blacks, as distrustful of each other as they were, needed to overcome that, work together in a political fashion to get representatives elected that would address their economic problems. And Tom Watson believed that the problems of the small white farmer and the small black farmer were the same, The problems of the white sharecropper and the black sharecropper were the same. The problems of the white tenant farmer and the problems of the black tenant farmer were identical. Economically, they were both impacted by the railroad, by the tariff, by banks that charged high interest rates. And so he was not calling for integration. He did not call for whites and blacks to be able to marry, because in most places throughout the South they were not. He wasn't calling for blacks to be able to serve on juries. In most places they were not. He was not calling for the integration of the school system throughout the South. He was still very much a racist who believed in white supremacy. But at least Tom Watson recognized that racism was preventing economic issues from being addressed. This is going to be a difficult sell, though, because the Civil War was only 25 years prior to the formation of the People's Party, and there's still so much distrust, and notions of white supremacy are still palpable throughout the South. But this is an opportunity, perhaps, to transcend that racism, at least for the purposes of politics and economics. As we'll see, this attempt to recruit industrial workers is going to be an uphill battle. This attempt to get black voters to vote for the People's Party is going to be an uphill battle. Just to kind of close this issue on the biracial coalition up, it's not going to work. Blacks who did have the right to vote in the South continued to vote for the Republican Party. Tom Watson became so dismayed that he actually joined the Ku Klux Klan and became one of the most outspoken racists of the early 20th century, which is saying a lot because there were some pretty outspoken racists in the early parts of the 20th century. But for a fleeting moment, there was a possibility that a new political arrangement in the South could be forged with the intention of bringing about reform for the creation of new opportunities for those who inhabited the lower stratum of the socioeconomic structure. And if we turn to slide 20 here, you'll see a slide that I put up previously, the People's Party and the Broad Alliance. And we've talked about prohibitionists, and we've talked about the industrial worker, and we've talked about this attempted biracial coalition, but you also see on here reformers. Now, these reformers were individuals who supported specific policies. For example, we have Bellamy clubs that have popped up throughout the United States. These were people who had read Edward Bellamy's fictional novel, Looking Backward, which is discussed in the Give Me Liberty textbook. These were people who were calling for an emphasis on a more powerful national government with the purposes of working collectively and cooperatively rather than having a society of fragmented individuals who performed their economic lives under this kind of Darwinistic survival of the fittest sort of way, maintaining that cooperative relationships could move society forward for the betterment of all. There were supporters of Henry George's single tax, which is also covered in the textbook, a single tax on unimproved land, so that land speculators would be forced up to sell their land and make it more affordable for the average American. There were numerous reform movements that were taking place that called for an active federal government that would open up opportunities for the producing element of the population. So you can take a look in the textbook for those reforming groups that the farmers who were leading the People's Party hoped to recruit as well. Now, it's one thing to say these are the groups we want to recruit to our political movement. These are the groups that we want to join our populist crusade. It's another thing to actually convince them to vote People's Party on Election Day. And so in our next lecture, Populist Part 2, we'll talk about the specific policies that the People's Party endorses through their Omaha platform. And this will give us a real good understanding of who the populists were and what they hope to accomplish. All right, I'll see you on the next lecture. Bye.